Hey everyone. Just a quickie at the start here. This one took me a lot longer and was a lot more work than usual to put together, so please engage with it and share it around everywhere you can if you like it. I'd really appreciate it. Also, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook, and you can tip me a coffee for my trouble here. Thanks in advance. Okay, let's get started. Final Fantasy VII was my first RPG. I grew up as a Sega boy, as in, I had the whole set. Yes, I was that cool, and you know you're jealous. While I probably had played a couple of text-based adventure games and some early puzzlers like Simon the Sorcerer, I was all about the side-scrolling platformer and the action game. I had a bit of a thing for Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter back in the day too, though I think that was more just about pissing my brother off. I'd played an action RPG of sorts called Light Crusader on the Mega Drive, and a dungeon crawler on the Sega CD called Eye of the Beholder, and I found that while I was drawn to speed and flashing lights, games that showed some kind of plot were the ones that I enjoyed the most. That being said, I remember looking at the boxes to games like Phantasy Star, seeing a bunch of numbers and immediately putting them down without even checking what they were about. When we got our first PC, I was mesmerized by build engine games like Doom and Duke Nukem. And when I discovered Tomb Raider, well, that was as good as gaming got for me for a very long time. It was actually my brother who requested Final Fantasy VII as a Christmas present, and I recall we had a hell of a time trying to get the damn thing to work, as our PC wasn't exactly the best, and not having internet at the time, patches weren't just something you could download in a couple of minutes. So when things finally got all set up and working and I decided it was time to see what this game was about, well, to say that my mind was blown and my entire worldview would never be the same again is something of an understatement. Never had I been so entranced by a game with a story this deep, with so many fascinating and cool characters, and a world with so much to see and do, and that was before I ever escaped Midgar and discovered that there was an entire world map to explore. And so it was that I had a new favourite genre and a new favourite game. I wasn't done with my shooters or janky experimental games like ODT by far, but I knew beyond a doubt that I was a story-first RPG lover from that point on. jrpgs. Okay, look, if anyone has the right to be upset with this term, it's Yoshi P, but I've personally only ever used it with reverence. That being said, we probably could do with a more descriptive term for these kinds of games. Anachronox follows all of the conventions of the genre and wasn't made in Japan, so it's definitely worth thinking about. So, these games don't have a great history of PC ports, and while Final Fantasy VIII did make it over to PC, and I played the absolute living crap out of it, Final Fantasy IX did not. Fortunately though, I had moved up in the world at that point. I had become a Sega boy again, and I had the pleasure of playing this. If RPGs do become a regular feature on this channel, then we are absolutely going to be talking about this masterpiece one day. But the main reason I bring it up is that it presented a unique opportunity for me. At the time, I was working with another guy at my part-time job who was also a big Final Fantasy fan, and who had a PlayStation. At some point during our various conversations about these two games, we got the idea that when we'd finish them, why not swap systems so we can each play the other game. And so it was, on a borrowed PS1, with a borrowed copy of the game, that I got to sit down and play for the first time what would become my all-time favourite Final Fantasy game. Which brings us all the way to now, more than 20 years later, and me finally revisiting it to see if it holds up. And well, long story short, it really does. So, let's get into it. This is Final Fantasy IX. In many ways, Final Fantasy IX was a return home for the series. Both 7 and 8 had been dark stories in somewhat dystopian science fiction worlds. The city of Midgar was a diesel-punk megalopolis filled with advanced robots and mecha, yet still connected by a fairly primitive railway system, while the world beyond the boundaries of Midgar felt like an untamed fantasy world, with small settlements reminiscent of something you'd stumble across in a classic Dungeons & Dragons setting. The world of 8 was painted in a much brighter colour palette from the start, but while Balam Garden might seem like some kind of science fiction Hogwarts on the surface, when you drill down and start to think about the implications, hiring out teenagers to be specialist soldiers to the highest bidder is a pretty bleak system overall. Is it any wonder really that Irvine buckled under the pressure of having to shoot a high-profile target like Sorceress Adia? I mean, he's just a kid really. He'd probably be a very interesting character study for a video sometime. Final Fantasy IX though was envisioned as a return to the series' roots. The 5th generation of consoles was ending, and the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, and a big black box from the company who made operating systems that everyone pirated were on the horizon. Producer Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted to create a game as both a send-off to this generation, and one that could more accurately portray the fantasy worlds he'd envisioned when they started building these for 8-bit consoles way back in the late 1980s. And the game wastes no time in letting you know exactly what it's all about. After a brief dream sequence where we see a tiny boat being violently tossed by a furious ocean, the dreamer awakens, and we see a beautiful princess, adorned with jewelry and sitting within a high tower in a magnificent crystal castle. This is no tale of moody teenagers carrying improbable weapons. This is a fairy tale. This is a world of towering castles, silver-clad knights, swords and sorcery, and galleons that sail the skies as effortlessly as the very birds. And as one such galleon passes us, we get a look inside and get our first glance of our hero. So, I'm not going to attempt to do anything like a full play-by-play of the story, with its every nuance and moments of character development explained. But before we move into the larger topics and maybe touch on some of the spoilers, and yes, that really has to happen this time, it's very hard to talk about the larger themes and implications of any Final Fantasy game without dropping spoilers about mid and even late game plot twists. But first, let's take a look at our setup. To do that though, we're going to have to descend from the skies above Alexandria, all the way down, maybe as far as we can go, to meet the audience point of view character, the little black magus that could, Vivi. The wide, bright eyes that stare out from beneath the brim of his pointy hat seem to be filled with childish wonder, and there's a reason for that. You see, while Vivi has the iconic Final Fantasy Black Mage look and, as we'll see later, can wield absolutely devastating power when called to, Vivi is just a child. Not even that really. He's basically a baby. He's very young, very naive, and really not equipped to face what's waiting for him down the road. But that's all for later. For now, this little guy just wants to go to watch a show at the theatre, and that's why he's come to the big city during this magnificent celebration, in honour of the 16th birthday of Princess Garnet Till Alexandros. And he's feeling more than a little overwhelmed. Our little hero has his first run-in with disappointment when he arrives at the ticket stand, only to be informed that his ticket is a fake. To consolidate the little guy, the teller furnishes him with 5 Tetramaster cards so that he can play one of this game's main mini-games, though this is something I don't really participate in much, but I'll talk about that a little later. It would seem luck strikes when another young and overexcited creature bumps into Vivi and offers him a chance to see the show for only the very small price of his freedom, and thus begins a death-defying trip across the rooftops of Alexandria, and our first meeting with these adorable and strange little Moogle creatures. The opening is really just maneuvering several major players into position, ready for fate to strike and thrust them into something far bigger than they could imagine. Which brings us to our hero Zidane, and the truth of his coming to Alexandria. While Tantalus is a famous theatre troupe renowned throughout the continent, they are also a group of skyfaring bandits. Sky pirates, you might say. No, wrong game. Tantalus, it seems, have set their sights on one hell of a prize this time, as they've come to kidnap none other than the birthday girl herself, Princess Garnet. The show is nothing but a large distraction that will allow Zidane to sneak into the castle, cause a riot, and in the process make off with the prize. The only thing standing between him and his target is the Sword of Alexandros herself, Beatrix, the captain of the Knights of Pluto, Steiner, and the wrath of Queen Braun Alexandros. So, nothing to worry about really. And at the start, things seem to be running smoothly. The show is captivating, the performance dazzles the crowd. Somewhat. And Zidane and his brother-in-arms Blank are able to infiltrate the castle, overpower 2 of the palace knights, and approach the royal balcony, which is exactly where things take a turn for the unexpected, as the princess, seemingly having the same idea as these boys, uses the distraction of the theatre show to make her own escape, leading to Steiner alerting all the guards into a fever pitch and calling for some sharp improvisation from our dashing rogues that all ends... Arriving on the Tantalus ship, the Prima Vista, it seems Princess Garnet had designs of her own to be kidnapped, and had taken it upon herself to basically escape the castle. And there I thought princesses in games were just prizes to be won, and this was the ultimate condemnation of them as sexist and terrible. I suppose when you start with the conclusion, you can make anything fit. Things climb to a climax as the guards, now searching for intruders, spot Vivi and his new friend, and give chase, leading to Vivi, Zidane, Steiner and Garnet all aboard the Tantalus ship, and with the jig well and truly up, there's only one thing for it.
Change your plan!
The reaction from the Queen is reckless to say the very least. And so, with the damage to the Prima Vista being substantial, it sinks from the sky and falls beneath the cloud of thick mist that covers the continent below, before crashing into a place known as the Evil Forest, no less. And so with that, 4 unlikely companions are thrust together by fate, and our real adventure begins. It's very difficult to discuss any of the larger themes that exist within Final Fantasy IX, or any RPG for that matter, without venturing into spoiler territory. And while I've no doubt that the majority of people watching this kind of review are people who've already explored this world, there's always a chance that some curious creature looking to tentatively dip their toe in the water has come to get some idea of what all the fuss is about. So, in the interest of not turning those people away just yet, why don't we start with the basics? At the core of every RPG is the world in which it takes place and the people who inhabit it. In fact, I'd probably put forward that exploring the world is actually the driving force behind every RPG, and that all of the stories, characters and side activities that you contend with are just an incentive to do just that. This is more obvious in Western RPGs like Skyrim and The Witcher, where galloping across vast open terrain and stumbling into adventure as you go is a big part of the game. But a good argument could be made that even these more linear narrative RPGs from Japan do the same thing, just a little differently. Each numbered entry in the Final Fantasy series is its own standalone story, which tells me quite a lot about the way the writing is handled here. An RPG series could take place on the same world at different stages in its history, and even have some crossover in events. Or it could happen in a single country or on a continent within a larger world, and dive into the culture unique to that particular part of the world. But every Final Fantasy is a world-spanning adventure of sorts. Each story has stakes on a global and sometimes universe-ending scale, and each places a lot of emphasis on discovering an entire planet, with its own unique history, culture, and especially magic, versus revisiting locations, lore and mythology that we are already acquainted with. In the dystopian dieselpunk world of Midgar, for example, magic is a product. It can be bought and used with fairly minimal training like any weapon or electronic device. Here in Final Fantasy IX though, magic is tied closely to intense training and magical talent inherent in the wielder. though the world is not entirely without the magic tech that formed a big part of Final Fantasies 6, 7, and 8. Final Fantasy IX takes place on a planet known as Gaia, and it is something we discover slowly, at first confined only to one major landmass, but later we uncover a much larger world as our characters grow stronger and our options for travel become more varied and a little wild at times. Travelling this world and learning about it is just as much of a wonder, if not more so, than anything in the main story. Gaia is, or seems to be, a dying world. The major landmasses that make it up seem to be formed of lifeless deserts and canyons, dying forests and frozen wasteland. There are very few civilizations in the world, with most of them focused on the Mist Continent, and those in turn focused into 3 large cities formed of an incredibly diverse mixture of creatures. All of these cities are constructed on plateaus high in the mountains above the mist, and the major forms of transport are airships that sail the skies above the mist, and mountain pathways guarded by military checkpoints. While at the start of the game, the kingdoms of the Mist Continent seem to be at peace, there is a strong sense of this being mine and that being yours, and wanting to keep people out of each other's territory. So, what's going on here? Well, we can find some of the answers for that in our very first dungeon area, the Evil Forest. As we begin our exploration of the forest, we discover that whatever this mist is, it's not some trick of condensing water, but something very powerful and even malevolent. It seems that the mist actually produces monsters, which would go a long way to explain why people are so adamant to stay outside of it. While the creatures in the Evil Forest are just ants compared to some of the monstrosities we'll face later, they certainly demonstrate the danger this bizarre mist represents for anyone unfortunate enough to be trapped within, and after Zidane and his unlikely adventuring party defeat a dangerous fiend, the forest seems unwilling to let them escape with their lives. So it's no wonder then that civilizations on the Mist Continent exist above it, and significant efforts have been made to making defying gravity a major form of transport. Drilling down deeper into the lore, we discover that the Mist Continent wasn't always covered in mist, and it was only after some significant point in the early history of the world that this became the case. It seems once the mist began to appear, not only did it bring dangerous monsters, but also began to incite a kind of madness in the people who lived within it, leading to war and other atrocities taking place. So it would seem that the survivors and the refugees of these early events found themselves congregating into the relatively small spaces above the mist, and creating an incredibly diverse and multiracial and cultural civilization. In fact, the populations of cities like Alexandria and Lindblum are so diverse and even bizarre in places that characters like Zidane and Vivi, who, as we discover later, are actually one of a kind, aren't paid a second glance. There just isn't a normal, or at least there isn't a regular for this wildly diverse population of anthropomorphic animals and other creatures to measure anyone against. I think this is one of the strengths of Japanese fantasy over Western fantasy. For example, if I say to you fantasy elf, there may be some differences in the image we conjure up based on which books, movies or games we favour, but we are all most likely thinking of a tall, slender person with light hair, pointy ears, and a bow and arrow, basically Legolas. This says to me that fantasy has been somewhat codified, and while within those guidelines there is room for all kinds of great exploration and subversion, well, doesn't fantasy mean the fantastical? Doesn't it mean the weird, wild and wonderful? Why should all elves live in forests and all dwarves live under mountains? Why should wizards have beards and be old and wise? Isn't that a kind of plagiarism? Why not a wizard who is a baby, or a dragon-slaying rat person? Why set out writing the fantastical and then look for the safety of established ideas and limitations? I'm not saying that it can't be done well, I just think maybe it's been done a little too much now. So I really like the way racial diversity is handled in games and stories like this. And in this particular story, the circumstances of the world have contrived to smash all the peoples of all the races into one big melting pot. Well, almost. Below the mist are two civilizations that still thrive and hold true to their own cultures. The people of Burmecia and Clara are rat people, whose greatest soldiers claim the title of Dragoon Knight, a recurring class in the series, wield long polearms, can leap into combat, and have a touch of a red mage look about them. The civilization split in two far back in history, in the aftermath of a civil war fought over a powerful magical artifact. The Burmecians live in their ancient ancestral city that seems to be protected from the mist by the constant rain that hammers it, while the city of Clara exists high atop a great tree that is protected by an eternally raging tempest. Historically, Burmecia and Alexandria have fought many wars, while Clara has remained fairly cut off from the world, and the people there have kept mostly to themselves. That being said, now is a time of peace. Both the old wounds between Burmecia and Clara have healed, and there is no war between the rat people and the people of Alexandria. The Burmecians also have an odd relationship with a powerful monster or creature called Gizmaluk, that we face as a boss in the game after it seemingly succumbs to madness, a theme that will be repeated a lot at the start of the game. There's a lot of hints and information that we can gather about these cultures, but it's all rather subtle, with many details being omitted. What's interesting is that each city has its own aesthetics and architectural design. We begin in Alexandria, which is the quintessential Fairytale Kingdom. The skyline is dominated by the Castle of Alexandria, with a literal crystal sword piercing the sky from its summit. Meanwhile, Lindblum is this odd steampunk magitech city with many automated doors, elevators, and even a monorail that ferries people around. While the architecture in the streets is somewhat similar to Alexandria's, there's definitely a touch of Industrial Revolution in there. Burmecia, on the other hand, has very Gaudi architecture, and there are big statues that remind me somewhat of the large sitting Buddha statues we have here in Japan, while Clara is this huge living tower that we explore from its tangled roots at the base all the way to the leaved branches at the very top. It's all just so magical and carefree. It feels more like something out of a children's book of fairy tales than some alternate Dungeons and Dragons setting. Of course, the art style that we'll talk about later plays a big part in this, and the walking and talking animals do add a touch of Disney into the mix, but this really feels like a world where the rules are different, and maybe even a lot more like guidelines than rules. Another great location is the decadent city of Trino, that is covered in an eternal night but never seems to sleep. It's a place of wealth and excess, with large structures like the card arena and the auction house filling the environment. At the other end of the scale we have strange swamps where these odd frog-eating people live, the fossil tunnels, the chocobo forests, and so much more. And that's just on the Mist Continent. Once we get out into the larger world, well, that's where things start to get really strange. The main method of travel on the Mist Continent is by airships that are actually powered by whatever this potent magic mist is. The actual mechanism of this is never explained, but it means that the ships are incapable of travelling too far beyond the borders of this land, and the development of a steam-powered flying ship is actually a major subplot in the game. As such, exploration beyond the Mist Continent is something only taken on by the bravest and the boldest, and the rewards for this seem slim. There are no large nations on the other landmasses to trade with, or wage war upon. In fact, there is only one small settlement of dwarves on Condé Petit Mountain, who are a very unique take on the concept of dwarves, and there's nothing else. Nothing native, anyway. The Outer Continent also plays home to the ruins of a tribe of summoners that play a significant role in the story, but it's mostly inhabited by Moogles now, and one interesting character, with the rest of her people having long passed away. Beyond that though, all of the other strange and bizarre places we visit belong almost entirely to the monsters and the wild creatures. Places like Ibsen's castle are truly bizarre in their layout and even how they manipulate game mechanics. This seemingly inverted or mirrored world means that the weakest weapons deal the most damage. The only other places where people gather are Esto Garza on the Lost Continent. This is one of the few places of a seemingly religious nature within the game. Very little time is spent on concepts like faith and gods in most Final Fantasy games, but at this place, with its designs very similar to a Buddhist temple in many ways, we see people gather to observe the Shimmering Isle, a place believed to be connected to the passage of souls on Gaia. Daguerre is the last and most obscure location to be found. It is a large library located on a tiny island far from anywhere. Its origins are never explained, and yet it plays home to a collection of travelers, explorers, and refugees who have nowhere else to call home. This place is completely optional and doesn't have any connection to any critical path events. It is connected to some of the side activities in the game, and is a place to learn lore and acquire high-level gear for the late game. All this combines to create a very lonely world. The Outer Continent and the Lost Continent are barren lands almost bereft of flora and fauna, and the world seems to belong almost entirely to dangerous monsters. While the major cities of the Mist Continent don't appear to be overcrowded, they are certainly densely packed, and beyond their borders, and beyond the range of the airships, is a land that belongs only to intrepid explorers and Mughals. So, you might be getting the idea just by looking at this place that something is very wrong here. Indeed, the seeming peace between the nations of the Mist Continent is far from the norm, and all that is about to get shaken up. So I guess it's time for our heroes to take center stage. Since we'll be talking about characters now, I'm going to put up a mid-game spoilers warning. I'll hold off on all the big stuff about Zidane until we get to talking about Kuja later in the video, but if you are that rare curious person looking to learn about the game, then go ahead and skip over to the presentation and gameplay sections. Watch that, and then absolutely go and play this, because it's awesome. Every Final Fantasy game has an impressive cast of heroes. There's always a couple of less developed characters in the bunch, but even they present considerable intrigue simply because of how much is left out for people to speculate on. This is another area where Final Fantasy, not being formed from regular fantasy tropes, goes a long way to subverting expectations. The leader of your average fantasy party would probably be one of the more physically imposing characters with a flair for leadership and a tendency towards self-sacrifice. You know, your idealistic paladin type who's maybe seen too much but doesn't want to give up on the world just yet. Here in Final Fantasy IX though, we have the charismatic carefree rogue, or bard depending on how you look at it, running the show. While Zidane here is definitely more than a little carefree with the hearts of women, and has some self-discovery to engage with on our journey, he is easily more emotionally mature than Cloud and Squall combined, and demonstrates compassion, empathy, and an adherence to responsibility from the outset, with none of the pessimistic edgelord angst our two previous heroes displayed. I still like these guys though. Don't get me wrong. Their transformations into their endgame forms is all the greater for their exceptionally moody origins. Especially this guy. Wow. I did not see that coming. But here is Zidane, our leader, our hero, and one half of the romantic lead. Zidane wears his heart on his sleeve, and despite being a thief by trade, is very direct and honest. That being said, he, like everyone in this scrappy ragtag band of heroes, is looking for his place in the world. For Zidane, this yearning comes from not knowing anything about where he came from. Despite Gaia having an incredibly diverse biosphere, there are no other monkey-tailed people anywhere in the world. And while Zidane has a family and a place among the band of rogues known as Tantalus, this hole in his personal history is something that gnaws at him, and even led to him deserting Tantalus more than once to sail the world and find the answer to the question, where did I come from? On the other side of that, we have Her Royal Highness Princess Garnet Till Alexandros, later known only as Dagger, the heir to the throne of Alexandria, and the party healer, and one of the two summoners we can use later in the game. The princess has been told from the very beginning of her life exactly who she is and who she will become, which when you think about it must be an absolute nightmare of a situation to be in, even if it does come with pretty dresses, jewellery, and a room with a view. Diamond-crusted bars and locks are still bars and locks. The opening is a wonderful subversion of the fairy tale narrative. Far from rescuing a princess from some kind of danger, at least as far as we know, we are the ones sent to whisk her away from her life of comfort and adoration to some unknown fate. And far from the princess simply waiting around for Prince Charming to turn up and rescue her, our princess has ideas of her own. And when we do get aboard the Tantalus ship, she says, "Well, sure ma'am, whatever you say." Dagger may not be your typical damsel in distress, but she's a well-written character and far from being some kind of Mary Sue. She may have had time to learn some handy acrobatics, and her white magic is one of the most important skills in the game, but once outside the castle, she very quickly finds herself way out of her depth. And as the stakes ramp up and the very foundations on which her life has been built shatter, she soon finds herself pushed beyond her limits. It's not exactly a spoiler to say that Queen Braun is one of the game's primary antagonists, and whatever has gotten into her even leads her to go so far as to order her own daughter's beheading. Dagger witnesses her mother succumb to greed, paranoia, and power lust, and even looks on as those vices lead to her mother's death at the hands of one of her own summoned creatures. And through all this, she sees the safety and security of her life as nothing more than an illusion, easily shattered. On top of all that, she discovers that she isn't even who she thinks she is. She was never the daughter of the queen, but rather, she was adopted as a baby. She is in fact one of the sole survivors of an ancient summoner tribe, and her nightmares are actually repressed memories of something truly terrible that befell her as a baby. Dagger has one hell of a rough ride all the way through this story, and it's only her relationship with her companions, and especially her first and one true love Zidane, that helps her pull through and become who she needs to be to fight the final battle. So, if I were to say the words powerful wizard, you might conjure an image something akin to this. There might be some variation, but I doubt any of you are thinking about a child right now. No, this kid is not powerful. Vivi is another great subversion of a fantasy cliché. Far from being old beyond his years, he looks upon the world with bright, wide eyes that are full of wonder, as if he's seeing all this for the first time, which he basically is. Vivi is only actually about 6 months old, with a body of about 9 years of age. He mentions that he was raised by his grandfather prior to this, but we later discover whatever that was, it wasn't exactly a biological relative. And neither did it have the best of intentions in taking in our little Magus here at the start either. Vivi came to the city to see the show when his grandfather mysteriously stopped moving one day, and that's about as well as he comprehends death at this point. In the Evil Forest we see Vivi not as a valiant hero, but as a terrified little boy, only able to summon his potent black magic when his very life is hanging in the balance. When asked to help in locating Princess Garnet, he honestly doesn't think there's any way he could possibly help, and later when exploring a village alone, he allows himself to be kidnapped by a group of farmhands who are able to hold him prisoner despite the fact he could easily overpower them. It just isn't in him to do any harm. Though he quickly learns about how dangerous the world is and what needs to be done to survive out in the wilds. Vivi may wear the robes of a black mage, but they just don't quite fit. The hat is big and dopey, the jacket is faded and patched, and he waddles around as though he's not quite sure how long his legs are, falling over quite regularly. So it's almost no surprise to discover that he's not exactly a prime specimen of his kind. In the same village where Vivi is kidnapped, we discover a factory that is mass producing black mages by infusing the strange mist into inanimate doll-like constructs. The purpose seems to be to create mindless automatons for war, and we get to see them used a lot. It turns out that Vivi is the prototype, and came into being with a lot more personality than had been planned. No doubt whoever made him had planned to take care of that, but the little guy vanished long before that could happen. While Vivi is very excited to see things that look like him at the start, he is quickly disheartened by their inability to communicate with him. The discovery that he is a made construct no doubt weighing him down as well. This is made so much worse when he does finally meet another Magus capable of speech in the form of the Black Waltz, and he sees just how much worse it can be. These creatures are particularly spiteful, and seem to enjoy pain and destruction. There is a scene early in the game aboard an airship that is a particular turning point for Vivi though. It foreshadows some big later game moments when the Black Waltz attacks the ship, and the other mages, despite being incapable of speech, move to protect him, and the reaction is volatile. This provokes Vivi to finally take a stand, and while it hurts him to turn his power on what he sees as his own kind, he is already beginning to learn that family and home isn't necessarily about how you came into this world and who you look like. We have a little more to talk about with Vivi and his black mages when we dive into the game's themes of death and the ever-changing nature of the universe. But for now, let's move on. For all this pain and strife though, is there a ray of light in the darkness? Well, yes actually, and it comes from a very unexpected place. Captain Adelbert Steiner isn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. In fact, there are times where the inside of his head seems as thick and hard as the metal that protects his skin. Steiner is a man who has completely defined himself by his role in society. He is captain of the Knights of Pluto and sworn protector of the Queen and the Princess. He has a very black and white view of the world and doesn't do a lot of thinking for himself at the start of the game. He is devoted to his queen and his duty, and his only other personality trait outside of that seems to be some kind of rivalry with General Beatrix and her soldiers. Steiner is prone to losing his cool and looking and talking down upon anyone he deems beneath him, though he is extremely polite and respectful when dealing with many others. In one early game section, Steiner's sense of duty has him running around cleaning a pub for a young lady, in a hope she'll help him get information. The line, "pubs are supposed to be a good source of information," made me chuckle. It feels like he read a book on how to be a fantasy adventurer, and is just following the steps presented there. Steiner may be frustratingly pig-headed at times, and even a little naive, but there are times where his simplistic view of the world and right and wrong really cuts through the veil and helps. He does a great job of encouraging and uplifting many characters in the game, and his natural leadership skills come through. He is also a devastating tank in battle, and his sense of duty and honour are exemplified in his transform that sees him adopt the mantle of the Paladin, a role shared by another great Final Fantasy hero. With the discovery of Queen Braun's deceit and descent into madness, Steiner, like everyone in this game, has many of his views about the world and the nature of right and wrong challenged. He is far more stoic than the younger characters, but eventually begins making his own choices about what he wants. Something that, accidentally, finds him stumbling into a love he never knew was there. In a way, it's kind of like how if you lose your job, it can feel like the ground has fallen from beneath you, but after a brief fall, you land into a much better job, and you find your life heading on down new and more exciting paths than you ever thought possible. These four characters form what I refer to as the A-Team. The primary conflict revolves almost entirely around them, and they are with us from the very beginning. The other guys all have their roles to play and their own arcs to travel, but they are a little less important overall than these four. Let's take a brief look at our B-Team. They are just as fascinating and imaginative as the FF9 Hero Starter Pack. They just don't have quite as big a story to share with us. Well, Eiko does, I guess, but her tale is stunted by being one of the last characters to join up with us on this journey. In the ruined summoner village of Madin Sari on the outer continent, we meet one of the last survivors of the tribe of summoners, and wouldn't you know it, she's a little girl trying to find her place in the world. Eiko's last living relative, her grandfather, passed away of old age some time ago, and since then she's lived in the village with only a group of Mughals to keep her company. She has assumed a kind of leadership or motherly role in this group, and takes it upon herself to venture out into the monster-infested continent to occasionally steal or scavenge from the dwarves at Condé Petit. She is usually joined on these expeditions by her closest friend, Mog, a much smaller Mughal that lives mostly in her clothes, but is easily scared and inclined to run away and hide at the first sign of danger. She's absolutely adorable, but might not be the best bro to have watching your back. Well, that's how it seems at first anyway. While Eiko has companions and people she cares for in her life, she is incredibly lonely, and feels confined to her village by a promise to her grandfather to stay put until her 16th birthday, when her powers will mature and she'll better be able to protect herself from danger. The events of the story of course conspire to wake those powers up much earlier than they usually would. Given how lonely she is, I think she can be forgiven if she mistakes the hope she feels at a dashing rogue like Zidane turning up and offering her a chance at a new life for romantic love. She is very young and naive after all. Her exploits in this area, such as cooking for him or approaching a professor to help her construct captivating poetry, has some truly wonderful and far-reaching consequences for several other characters in the game. There's clearly something to her more direct and somewhat immature approach to things like this. We stuffy adults constantly get in our own way and dither and stumble, rather than simply saying what's on our mind and going after the things we want. That's just the game we play, I suppose, and maybe it's the price we pay for developing ever more sophisticated streams of consciousness. Despite her age and diminutive stature, Eiko shows great bravery in the face of danger, and her transformation as a character is exemplified in the discovery that Mog, far from being another Moogle, is actually one of her guardian spirits. And while she may be prone to running away, when the chips are down and there's nothing more to do than draw back the veil, well, the results are explosive. Freya is a Dragoon Knight from Burmecia, though she hasn't been home for a long time. When we first meet her, she has arrived in Lindblum to compete in the Festival of the Hunt, a seemingly much more dangerous version of the running of the Bull, where monsters are released into the streets of the city and the brave and reckless battle them for points, while the sensible people lock their doors and wait out the madness. It's a somewhat brutish tradition, all things considered. After all, it's one thing to fight a monster that sees you on the road and thinks you're a free meal. It's quite another to take them out of their natural habitat and release them into the streets of your city so that they can be slaughtered for amusement. Freya is quite the carefree adventurer when we meet her. She has chosen a life of travel, adventure, and even hardship, and is already acquainted with our hero and his womanizing ways. Like Steiner, she has a title in that she is a Dragoon Knight, but unlike him, she doesn't make her role the foundation of her identity. In her backstory, Freya once loved another knight named Sir Fratley, who was considered Burmecia's greatest dragoon, but he took to the road himself in hope to elevate his skills even higher, and never returned. Freya in part journeys in hope of finding her lost love, though she isn't exactly stuck in the past. Queen Braun's attack on Burmecia finally drives Freya to return home and fulfill her duty as a protector of her people and her king. When she arrives in Burmecia, she is devastated to find it is too late to help. Freya is a warrior through and through though. She's the only character who can access the ability Dragon Killer, which should say a lot about her. She channels her grief into rage and directs it at the architect of her pain. She is likewise known by name to her king, and clearly well respected even among the Clarons, who invite her to join in the traditional dance that strengthens the protecting magic around their home. Most of Freya's character development happens in the first third of the game though, the most critical point being the return of Sir Fratley during the fight for Clara, and the discovery that while he's alive, the memory of his past is completely gone. This particular thread is oddly never expanded upon. There are no hidden late game areas that reveal the cause of his amnesia, or offer a chance for him to recover. He isn't even seen again after this point until the epilogue. There's nothing wrong with this exactly. Not all secrets need to be revealed, but it might have been a nice way to make her relevant again towards the end of the game. Still, Freya is as tough as nails and has plenty of stopping power against even the most powerful enemies. And her dogged determination and her playful jibes at Zidane make her very endearing. So, that just leaves these two. You might not think it to look at this one, but Quina does have a surprising amount of depth despite being a more comic relief style character. This odd, genderless creature is exploring the way of the gourmand and is on a quest to become a master chef by way of eating basically everything so it can sample all tastes and flavours. The fact that Zidane is on a world-spanning quest of his own is just a convenient reason for Quina to come along with him. They have very little investment in the primary conflict beyond the idea of the world ending, making it very difficult to find more things to eat. That being said, Quina has this incredibly childlike curiosity about the world, and is always running off to explore every new area they find themselves in. This often leads to them getting into trouble, as their social intelligence and concepts of things like basic commerce isn't very good. but this is just incredibly charming. In truth, their simple, uncomplicated view of the world shares some similarities with Steiner's, though, unlike the rusty, rigid knight, Quina is more like a Buddha. It simply rolls with the punches, taking the line of least resistance to wherever it may lead next. It is running water flowing through life. Bad experiences don't jade or dampen their view of the world and their desire to keep exploring. This might be a lesson for us all, to not stick or get stuck on things like Steiner, but to just keep on rolling whichever way the wind is blowing. Our final hero is Amaranth, also called Salamander in Japanese. We first hear of him in Trino, where his face comes up on a wanted poster, and he is later hired by the Queen to hunt and kill Vivi and recover Princess Garnet. Appearing later in the game as a boss fight for Zidane, Amaranth displays a great sense of nobility and honour, chasing off another bounty hunter who had resorted to kidnapping Eiko to lure the party into a confrontation. While his personality is aloof and closed off, Amaranth displays great humility in his defeat. He cannot understand why Zidane wouldn't kill him after overpowering him, and agrees to come along and join their adventure. He is willing to accept that his worldview may be wrong, or at the very least there might be more to it than he initially thought, another skill quite a few people could do with learning in this day and age. Amaranth develops an interesting camaraderie with Freya. While their initial meeting doesn't go so well, he eventually opens up to her about how he had once been a security guard in Trino, and how Zidane changed everything by framing him for a theft and turning him into an outlaw. At a later point, in an area called Ibsen's Castle, he breaks from the group and challenges them to a race to the prize hidden within. He is determined to prove to Zidane that companions are dead weight, a fact that doesn't go so well for him in the end. What is even more surprising for him though, is that despite all that, Zidane comes back to bail him out of the trouble he finds himself in. While he remains crass and almost offensively direct at times, the redhead outlaw shows himself to be a capable warrior and even a trustworthy companion. He changes quite a lot, as even he finds people to call companions and maybe even a place to call home. Phew. That was a lot. I actually hadn't planned on giving a synopsis of every character like that, but it just didn't feel right to not acknowledge every face in the lineup in some way. Also, while they all come from wildly different backgrounds and have very different outlooks on life, they are all in their own way looking for the same thing, for a place in the world, to know who they really are and to struggle and fight for hope, even when it all seems so hopeless. So, those are our heroes. I guess we should talk about the villains. I don't want to labour the spoiler warnings any more than I have to, so this will be the last time. By the time we get to talking about these two characters, the gloves come off completely, and it will be no holds barred. So if you really don't want this game's later plot twists and deeper themes exposed to you, skip on over to the presentation and gameplay section now. Okay, I'd say I've been more than fair at this point, especially given how long this is turning out to be. Probably the most popular fantasy action games to come out of Japan at the moment are From Software's Souls and Souls-adjacent games. The philosophy that exists at the heart of these stories is in accepting the changing nature of the universe and not trying to hold on to things past their time. This is something found within Eastern spiritual beliefs such as Buddhism and Taoism. The strife in all these games is born out of trying to deny change, to grasp at something and hold it in place even as that thing decays and becomes putrid within your hands. Salvation only comes in letting it go and embracing whatever comes next, because whether it seems better or worse to some or others, it is what is fundamentally right. Immortality is a shared theme in both Dark Souls and Sekiro, and those who seek immortality are the ones cast as the central villains within these games. Change is scary and sometimes painful, but it's also exciting and wondrous. All too often though, change is thrust upon us rather than being something we walk into willingly with our eyes open. We don't ask to get old. We rarely proactively sabotage our careers or relationships. And we can feel a sense of loss even when we lose things that were detrimental to us or holding us back. Change is unknown, and the more we have to lose, the scarier it can be. And no one has more to lose than those with wealth and power. Queen Bran Raza Alexandros was once a good queen and a caring mother. But the last war between Alexandria and Bermesia took her husband from her and set in motion something that would change her forever. At the start of the game, we see Princess Garnet actually wants to escape the castle, and her mother's response to this is far from measured. You couldn't exactly be blamed for thinking Garnet's well-being was not at the forefront of her mother's mind here. The Queen keeps counsel with Thorn and Zorn, two wretched little imps that deploy the Black Waltzes with all their malice after the princess and her would-be kidnappers. And of course, she commissioned the production of the Black Mage army that she plans to turn on her enemies. But what enemies, you ask? Isn't the Mist Continent enjoying an era of peace? Well, yes, but who can say what those degenerates in Limblum are really thinking? No doubt all this airship research is just a way for them to carry weapons right up to Alexandria's front gates. And how about those Bermesians and Clarens all the way down there in the mist with their strange culture and magic? Can they really be trusted? What if the Queen were to wake up one day and find her enemies at her door, her people besieged, her city aflame? What if they stripped her of her throne, her power, maybe even stole her life? It's better that she push the button first. This is the only way she can protect her people and their way of life. What cause could be nobler than sparing her people from imagined suffering and death by bringing real suffering and death upon others, especially when her daughter possesses such incredibly potent weapons? Far from caring for her daughter's safety, the Queen only wishes to retrieve the Eidolons bound inside her. Summoned monsters have been a feature of Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy III, and became an integral part of the story, even being called Eidolons in Final Fantasy IV. These spells represent something primal, something fundamental being manifest in the world. It's the closest we get to gods in these settings. In 7, for example, they are the most powerful materia, representing the very will of the planet, a living organism unto itself, materializing as extremely powerful creatures with the most devastating and explosive attacks. In 8, the Guardian Forces were the foundation of the power of the Seed members, binding themselves into the characters and enabling them to extract and harness incredible magic power to boost their stats through junction or call forth their guardians to overpower their enemies. The Eidolons in FF9, like those in 7, are manifestations of the heart of the planet, and they bind themselves to members of the now lost Summoner tribe. These people were wiped out in a terrible catastrophe long ago, and now only Garnet and Eiko remain. One of the most powerful Eidolons is the Dragon King Bahamut, a Final Fantasy regular along with Shiva and Ifrit, but Bahamut is rarely the most powerful summoner, and in FF9 he's outmatched by divine power incarnate in the Titanic Alexander. And then there's this transforming ship too. I mean, it's not the strangest summon. Have you seen the Magus Sisters? Now, I'm not about to try and excuse the Queen her actions entirely. I truly believe that the potential to do what she did came from inside her all along. But you might think it just a little odd that a loving mother and benevolent ruler would simply become a tyrant capable of mass genocide while exploiting her daughter. So, maybe there was something dark inside her all along, but it's pretty obvious that something else has dialed that up to 11. Final Fantasy rarely introduces its true villain at the start of the game. President Shinra and even Sorceress Adia were only masks of something far more dangerous waiting to reveal itself. And it's in Bermesia, at the heart of the ruined palace, that we find the Queen, her general, and a strange benefactor responsible for making the Black Mages. And after Beatrix is done mopping the floor with us, and leaves us for dead, we get our first good look at Kuja. You may have noticed in the character section that I somewhat glossed over the story of our hero Zidane in favour of talking about Vivi. And while I personally do love Vivi more than Zidane, for real, he's battling Oren for my all-time favourite FF character, and both these guys wield utterly terrifying power. The main reason I couldn't talk so much about Zidane is that these two are a pair. Kuja is a true nemesis, not just a powerful enemy, but a dark reflection of our hero, someone the hero could very well have been if only his circumstances were just a little different. And indeed it's true that Zidane was designed and manufactured to be Kuja's replacement. And that is the big revelation about our hero's origins that he's searching for. And the reason that despite everything they go through together, Zidane can't help but feel a little sympathy for his enemy. Kuja is cold, calculating and manipulative. He demonstrates incredible power, surviving devastating attacks with only a scratch to show for it. He is unrepentantly selfish and self-serving, and shows no connection to anyone or any desire to help anyone but himself. He is very hateful, and enjoys lording his power over others. What separates Kuja and Zidane is that while Zidane has no idea where he came from, Kuja knows exactly where he came from, and has more or less been made to suffer because of it. They are both aliens, believe it or not, creatures from another world called Terra, and are actually born from a much more sophisticated version of the process that manufactures the Black Mages. While Queen Bran represents a more relatable fear of change, the Terran's gambit borders on the existential, as they are in fact on a quest to attain that greatest of all sins, immortality. The pulsing heart of the worlds in Final Fantasy IX are crystals. Crystals are actually incredibly important in every Final Fantasy game, and may be one of the few truly connecting threads in the series, and the strongest argument for a Final Fantasy connected universe. Just like the lifestream in Final Fantasy VII, the crystals are the source of life on the planet, sending forth energy to take the shapes of people and animals, all of which return to it upon their death, to be recycled into whatever comes next. This cycle continues until, like everything, a crystal dies, and possibly goes on to join an even greater crystal at the heart of the universe. The crystal of the Terran world was old and dying, and so its people devised a way for that crystal to literally devour the crystals of newborn worlds and extend their planet's life, effectively creating the first vampiric planet. I don't think I've ever come across a concept this wild in Western fantasy. So remember how I said Gaia seemed broken, like something bad had happened a long time ago? Well, when Terra tried to merge with Gaia, the crystal fought back. And the broken remains of Terra now reside inside Gaia, greatly weakened, with the soul energy, the essence of its people, kept mostly in storage, and sometimes siphoned into sleeve-like genomes, and this is what Kuja and Zidane are. Most importantly, they are built for purpose, to finish what was started thousands of years ago. Kuja is the Angel of Death. He is supposed to break the cycle of life and death on Gaia, weaken its crystal, and enable Terra to finally merge with Gaia. He knows who made him and why. He has a purpose, divine purpose no less. His actions will save his people and bring about a new Garden of Eden for them. He is a messiah, and yet despite all that, Kuja never asked for any of it. In his mind, he was born into bondage, enslaved to an older Terran called Garland, and most of his actions have been about trying to acquire enough power to finally stand against his master and even destroy the remains of Terra. Something he ultimately achieves when he abandons trying to possess powerful eidolons and embrace another manifestation of the world's primal power, the trance. As this is a major game mechanic, well, sorta. We'll talk about it more later, but the effects of this, as you can see, are quite devastating. So you can see that death and escaping death are very important themes here in Final Fantasy IX. The Terran desire for immortality is at the very heart of all Gaia's troubles, and it also comes up in Vivi's character arc when, later in the game, we arrive in the Black Mage village. So the mist is actually the soul energy of the Gaian crystal. It has been blocked from returning to the crystal by a Terran monstrosity called the Leafer Tree, and those souls aren't very happy. This is what causes monsters to appear, and why people who stay within the mist are slowly driven to paranoia and aggression. So while the Black Mages have constructed bodies, they do have souls of a sort. They are animated by the same fundamental energy as everyone else, and while they may seem like mindless machines, more than a few of them have become self-aware and have managed to escape and form their own small society on the outer continent. However, Black Mages, just like replicants in Blade Runner, have a limited lifespan built into them as a failsafe for this kind of event, and very soon members of their community stop moving. Being more or less children, similar to Vivi, they are naturally afraid of this, seeing themselves as small, finite individual things, and not as expressions of this eternally changing cycle of energy perpetuated by the crystals. This of course is something for our own little Magus to concern himself with too. Fortunately though, by this point, he has found friends and comrades, and become invested in an enterprise far greater than himself. He routinely faces danger, and would rather live a short life full of time spent adventuring and even suffering with those he holds dear, than sell his soul in a bid to extend it. The other mages though, their fear is manipulated by Kuja, who promises them to extend their lives in exchange for their servitude. Driven by their fear, they flock to their messiah in hope of salvation and are pushed into acts of violence on Kuja's behalf. That is all except for these two. These two mages, you see, have found something greater than themselves to care for. They have this chocobo egg, and they are keeping it safe and warm. And while the other mages are driven to actions they regret in favour of self-preservation, these guys give birth to a beautiful new life, and experience the absolute bliss of partaking in the natural cycle of renewal in the universe. Let's be real here, the symbolism is far from subtle. Zidane experiences his own crisis on Terra, when Garland explains he is nothing more than a manufactured replacement for Kuja, who was stolen away and abandoned on Gaia before his purpose could be explained to him. But he, like Vivi, has a lot of friends who aren't going to let him sulk about it, and who sharply remind him that the words home and family don't have to mean where you were born or how you came into being. Meanwhile, Kuja, a creature that has become a bitter loner, reacts to the discovery of his own impending death with rage and jealousy. If he is to be denied life, then all things will be denied life. And this leads to him travelling to Gaia's heart through the realm of Memoria to try and shatter its crystal and end the world for good. Well, if that isn't one hell of a drama, then I don't know what is. Every Final Fantasy deals with themes of life and death, of suffering and strife. The stories of these games seem to go from bad to worse, and the heroes seem so small in the face of the powers that are lined up against them. Each character, being well fleshed out, has doubts and fears of their own, and each in turn is required to step up and learn things about themselves and readjust their view of the world. No matter how bleak things get, the heroes always push on, helping each other through the darkest times and the greatest pains to emerge from the other side of their suffering as something far greater than they ever imagined they could be. The dim-witted knight becomes the paladin, the baby black mage becomes the grand magus, the lost girl of an ancient tribe becomes a powerful summoner, and the carefree rogue becomes a true leader, a great hero, and maybe, just maybe, he's enough of a man to steal the heart of a queen. The stories and the characters are no doubt the very soul of these games, and why they are loved by so many all over the world. Why even now the older entries in the series are discovered by new players who in turn go on to really fall in love with them. As, just like in any good book, we may all read the same words on the screen, but in our minds we are all in our own adventures, and we all connect with these characters and their incredible struggle in our own way. Now, in my opinion, a good story can carry a mediocre game very far indeed, but there is a limit to this. In the end, games are not read, they are played. So I guess it's time we took a look at the presentation and gameplay of what I still consider to be an absolute masterpiece in interactive storytelling. The PlayStation Final Fantasy games are all almost perfectly fit to purpose. That is to say that each game succeeds in performing exactly what it sets out to do within the restrictions of the technology available. In fact, I'd argue that working within the limitations of the PlayStation 1's tech was to the game's benefit and not a detriment. It's not that I don't like cool modern graphics, but I feel like a big problem with AAA game design today is because they have all the money and the technology to make anything, they feel like they somehow have to put everything into the game. leading to the inclusion of a lot of half-baked systems that don't contribute anything of value to the overall player experience, and bloated, albeit very pretty, open worlds that comprise of mostly empty space that you just fast travel around after you've been there once. So the limitation in disk space and processing power meant that, even with big budget, multi-hour extravaganzas like this, developers had to be strict about what made the cut and what didn't, and aesthetic design and style had to take precedence over realism. Leaning into these limitations is exactly what made Final Fantasy VII so damn charming, and is a big reason why I still can't bring myself to play the remake, at least not until I see a hefty discount on the price. The point here is that good writing, compelling characters, and coherent aesthetics means you can tell a dark and gritty story with far-reaching themes, even with low-poly, blocky character models. If you've watched everything up to this point, you might think that Final Fantasy IX, with all its existential dread, loss, and heartbreak, is a very depressing game. Honestly though, it doesn't take itself all that seriously, most of the time. While 8 was an experiment in a more realistic looking world, 9 is something of an upgrade on 7's hyper-stylized look. The characters are all larger than life, and Alexandria with its mishmash of animal races feels like it was inspired by Disneyland at times. When we arrive there at the start of the game, we are just in time for the big parade too. Characters like Vivi and Steiner are very goofy, with the squat little Magus waddling around and tripping over constantly, and the big lug bouncing and clanking with every step, while his personal theme tune, more or less, sums him up in his entirety. To Final Fantasy fans, the legendary Nobuo Uematsu needs no introduction. This absolutely beautiful human being was the composer for the first 9 games, and has been a significant figure in the music of every game after those. He is one of the most important people in the entire history of Final Fantasy, and a critical figure in developing both the identities of each individual game and the series as a whole. And make no mistake, Mr. Uematsu is absolutely on point here, capturing the essence of this world and its characters and drama with his wonderful score. My knowledge of musical composition and appropriate vocabulary for talking about it though is very limited, so I'll just say that if you haven't already, you really need to attend one of the Final Fantasy Distant World concerts as soon as you get the chance. They are absolutely breathtaking. Now, I've talked about how fantasy is somewhat codified, that we all know what a fantasy elf or dwarf is to one degree or another. Final Fantasy has its own visual identity though. It's something that carried over from the original 8 and 16-bit games, where small sprites needed to be instantly recognizable. This visual language is shared in each entry, with black and white mages standing out quite easily for all to see. Likewise, many creatures cross over. We all know roughly what a Final Fantasy bomb looks like, that they are usually weak to blizzard, and that if you don't kill them in 3 hits, they'll explode, usually taking out at least one party member in the process. Since 9 was something of a homage and send-off to those original entries, we find that same visual language here, in the likes of Garnet's white mage robe, the Black Mage design, and even Steiner's classical knight and paladin look. Meanwhile, Zidane and Amaranth are unique designs with their own interesting features. I mean, look at this hair. This gives us a good mix of the old and new, and made heroes that were both original and immediately recognizable. The music, the world, and the character design all feed into the game's tone, and create this wonderful Fairytale Kingdom, full of magic and mystery for us to have our adventure in, and it allows for a tone that can vary quite wildly at times, but still feel consistent throughout. One minute you can be with a princess while she grieves the loss of her mother, the next you're playing a jump rope game as Vivi. Or maybe your friends are trapped and helpless in cells with death gradually approaching, and then you're a polymorphed frog with an adorable mustache, slowly creeping to steal a key that's guarded by this strange creature here. Maybe you're seeing Eidolons level entire cities, and not long after you're charging around the map on a big yellow bird, searching for buried treasure. It all just fits. Incidentally, recent interviews on FF16 have even revealed that side activities like card games and fishing won't be appearing, because they wouldn't fit the darker, more realistic tone of the game. So these low-poly, stylized fantasy characters painted in very saturated colours, allowed for some incredible creative freedom, letting Square tell a story that was at once serious and meaningful, but also knew how to have fun and make you laugh at just the right moments. It's almost like they've had a lot of practice at this. Two words that really excite me when I'm talking about retro games are pre and rendered. And we can't very well talk about PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy without talking about its pre-rendered backgrounds and cutscenes. Cutscenes are one area where Square has always excelled, and they've even continued with them long into a time where in-game graphics are more than up to the task, and in most cases even preferable because they cost less to produce and don't break the consistent look of the game. Back in the PS1 era though, cutscenes were like little rewards that you'd get for hitting milestones in a game. Sure, many of the biggest summons and most devastating spells are mini rewards unto themselves, but the most dramatic moments played out like full 3D movies where no expense was spared on the animation. Here we saw these blocky characters with low resolution textures really spring to life. We'd see them as they were truly envisioned, and watch their faces emote as the most spectacular and heart-stopping moments of the drama took place. I always felt like we got an extra special treat in Final Fantasy IX, when we actually got to see summoned monsters appear in full CG glory. I remember my breath catching in my mouth when the sky parted and Odin, a personal favourite of mine since 7, came riding in lance-bared to wipe Clara completely off the map. Then there's the arrival of the Dragon King Bahamut and his exceptional standoff against Alexander. We wouldn't see this guy looking this good again until his very dramatic appearance in Final Fantasy Advent Children. These cutscenes actually gave the games a lot of replayability, as if you didn't have a save game before they took place, replaying was often the only way you'd get to see them more than once. Fortunately though, the remaster has a cutscene theatre that unlocks after you finish the game, so you can appreciate them anytime you want. As a channel that's covered a lot of survival horror games, I've talked before about my love of pre-rendered backgrounds. From isometric CRPGs to point-and-click adventures, this somewhat forgotten art is a staple of many late 90s and early 2000s game genres, even popping up in some areas of Final Fantasy X on the much more powerful PlayStation 2. The process was a matter of simply rendering full 3D environments with complex geometry on a powerful PC, and then using that image and some cleverly placed colliders to create a background for the game. It was a great workaround that created the illusion of highly detailed environments with only a fraction of the power required to actually render them in real time. The trade-off was that the camera couldn't rotate dramatically, and so if that was required, the game would shift into a pre-rendered cutscene. I think the Blade Runner game is one of the best for this, but it's a feature common in Final Fantasy 7, 8 and 9, and a very smart workaround for some of the old console limitations. All of this comes together so well. It's all so clear and easy to see. There isn't a moment where I'm shaken out of the story by an ugly aesthetic or jarring music. Everything contributes to the game in a meaningful way, and combines to create this really consistent, fantastical world that's full of love, care, and pure imagination.
Well, here we are at last. I've spent a good amount of time singing this game's praises, and I will admit to not being able to remove the nostalgia glasses entirely and tackle this with more objectivity. The fact remains though that Final Fantasy IX is a beautiful story that's very well told. Games, however, are not just stories, they are meant to be played after all. And while I've got plenty of good things to say about the gameplay, make no mistake, I was screaming and calling bullshit at my monitor on more than one occasion. And one of the game's major side activities, the one that is critical to unlocking the majority of the endgame equipment, is absolutely awful. Almost to the point where it makes me reconsider every time I think about replaying this. The good news is that it's more or less optional. It really just depends on what kind of endgame fight you want to deal with. So let's dive in. I'll try to sandwich my, let's call it passionate criticisms of the game between the good stuff, so that we can start and end on a high note. To begin with the basics. Final Fantasy 1 through 10 have an incredibly strong sense of identity, and were basically designed on an if it isn't broke, don't fix it kind of formula. It's only from 11 onwards that development started to get really experimental, leading to things getting choppy and very hit and miss. I'm not sure how I feel about all that, but that's also not the point of today's already overly long conversation. Playing the games is divided into basically watching the story unfold through cutscenes and in-game character interactions, usually but not always in some kind of town area, and fighting enemies in dungeons full of random turn-based encounters. These combat dungeons will usually climax with some larger boss enemy, and after that you'll emerge back into another town area where you'll advance more of the story, tool up your characters with better equipment, and set back out into the world to fight monsters, grind XP and get stronger. Rinse and repeat until the end game. Stories in Final Fantasy are all delivered in a linear storybook fashion. The characters are fully written and realised, and we have absolutely no control over what they say or do. The story is always the same, and we rarely, if ever, get dialogue options to choose, and these, when they happen, have little to no effect on how events will unfold from there. So there is basically no emergent story or personal narrative to weave here. Sure, each character is open to some interpretation from each person playing the game, but they're all going to fall into the same ballpark, as you are basically just reading a book. This isn't a negative though, it's completely fine. It's perfectly fit for purpose. As I said, the games know what they are, and aren't trying to be everything for everyone, and since that formula sold gangbusters, no one at Square felt the need to mandate changes or update things based on marketing trends. Final Fantasy I codified what RPGs would be in Japan and continued iterating on that idea for a very long time. This also applies to random turn-based combat. It's such a long-running feature that it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who's played any other Final Fantasy game. If you don't want your exploration interrupted by numerous random battles that you are required to grind through to get strong enough to beat dungeon bosses, don't play Final Fantasy. However, if you're maybe just meh or lukewarm on the idea, but feel a good story can more than compensate for mechanics that you're not so into, then absolutely dive into this because you are gonna love it. One area where Final Fantasy IX chose to mix things up with its story was with the inclusion of active time events. Since many of your band are exploring the world for the first time, arriving in a new place tends to prompt everyone to abandon Zidane and go charging off to do their own thing. Then, when you're exploring the area for yourself, you'll be prompted that an active time event is happening, and have the choice to take a look. This will skip you over to another character, and let you see their personal adventures. We aren't actually controlling them here, just watching, but these are great little moments of characterization for our heroes, letting us see them in moments of real vulnerability, or lost in their own private thoughts. It's a nice idea even if it does break pacing and get a little tedious at times. So you move around, talk to characters, watch moments of intense drama as the crew get together, split up, and come together again, with the most dramatic moments punctuated as full CG cutscenes. But when all that's done, it's time to go out adventuring, and it's time to battle. While 7 and 8 had classless systems that let any character play any role, 9 has strict classes, similar to the original entries and class-based RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. Each class has abilities unique to it, and there's a pool of shared passive abilities that every character can learn. Abilities are learned through a fairly interesting system that starts by equipping weapons and armor that grant abilities, and then gaining ability points in battle to let the characters learn and keep the ability without having the weapon or item equipped. They then equip more potent gear, get more abilities, and rinse and repeat. Passive abilities range from damage boosts to certain types of enemies, immunities to certain status ailments, or automatically hasting or regenning the character. The catch is these passives need to be activated using a limited pool of gems, the number of which increases with your level. This is basically to stop all but the highest level characters from walking around like super tanks that can block every attack and wreck every monster, no questions asked. So, early game, you'll be customizing characters based on your equipment and ability loadout to deal with very specific enemies and situations. It's generally always a good idea to have Bright Eyes equipped on any physical character to prevent them from being blinded, and Loudmouth on any magic character to prevent them from being silenced. However, after you've been in an area for a while and got a feel for the enemies that spawn there and what kind of attacks they use, you can better customize your party into a devastating force that sweeps through many challenges. Combat in Final Fantasy IX uses the series' classic active time battle system that gives each character a little time gauge that fills up, leading to the point where you can issue commands to them and they can make a move. One major criticism leveled at the game was just how long each battle takes to start up. From the moment the screen transition begins to the moment we are officially in combat is... well, it's longer than in previous games, and noticeable enough that when you're ploughing through hundreds of these things, it starts to get pretty annoying, and has you bashing buttons in hope of skipping through it, even though you know that doesn't work. Fortunately, the Steam version does allow you to adjust the speed of battles, meaning you don't have to suffer through this anymore. It's a good compromise. We get to see the game as it was at launch, but also have the option to skip past some of the more tedious features. Another feature that was implemented in the remaster was the ability to turn off random battles, and oh god, this is such a welcome relief that I can't for the life of me think why it was never brought in before. I'm sure they could have playtested the idea on different builds. Hell, they probably have it in the debug commands for the developer builds, so how could they not know that people want this? Purists will argue that Final Fantasy dungeons have a risk-reward kind of exploration, where exploring side passages and backtracking for chests comes with the risk of more battles, but the reward of more loot. It sounds good on paper, but I honestly had a lot more fun being able to switch off battles and go searching through dungeons for secrets, or to move from a save point to a boss without having something show up to grief my fully restored party along the way. In the end, I still have to engage with the combat. If I don't fight, I don't level up. If I don't level up, I can't defeat the game's bosses. At least not without knowing the speedrun strats. But there's no reason not to let me engage with this on my terms and at my pace. And because it's a toggleable option, it doesn't affect anyone else. Relax guys, we can place the bonfire outside the fog wall, okay? Nobody would lose anything. So while this game does reward strategic party management and the late game can be really fun, a lot of the early game especially can be incredibly frustrating and just feels really cheap at times. I'm pretty sure we all know the importance of a good healer in an RPG, and just how devastating losing one can be. So it's really annoying that the game contrives to separate our only white mage from the main group for so much of the early game, and even after she rejoins you, seemingly for good, and you can start using her full summoning powers, also decides to randomly gimp her and rob her of turns in battle until another story event deals with her problems. And look, before you all start typing skill issue or saying just use Eiko, let me come back with a very well thought out and well constructed reasoning about this. Shut up. Okay, so yeah, it probably is a skill issue on my behalf, but areas like Gizmaluk's Grotto, and that boss fight in particular, are way harder than they'd be if I had a dedicated healer who could heal the whole party in a single turn. But instead I'm constantly on the back foot as my party chugs potion after potion and barely has any time to get off any attacks of their own, because they're trying to stop themselves from dying. There are lots of ways to create challenging games like this, and it's my preference that difficulty should come from giving enemies a plus rather than giving the party a minus. You are very welcome to disagree with me about this, but it frustrated the hell out of me. Contrast that with the next boss fight in Burmecia with Beatrix. At this point, Freya could use Raise Wind, which casts regen on the party. So while Beatrix is a stronger enemy, I have some breathing room to actually fight back instead of constantly having to heal from attacks just to stay in the fight. Challenging for sure, frustrating? Not at all. This brings me to my next big complaint. You have this incredible system for loading out characters with buffs to protect them against certain things, or deal extra damage to certain monsters, but short of checking a guide, you have absolutely no idea ahead of time which ones will benefit you when you enter a new area or boss fight. You can only use them in a reactionary way. It's not so bad for regular mobs, since you'll survive all but the worst outcomes, like the entire party getting confused and yeeting themselves, but for boss fights it's pretty annoying. You are faced with either slogging through a much tougher fight as you have to spam potions and remedies to keep characters alive and functional, or, and I chose this option more than once, reload your save, check a guide online, and spec out members to defend against the boss's attacks, and then re-enter the fight. Hear me out here guys, but isn't that a problem? If I'd rather break my immersion and reset the game rather than suffer through some bullshit that I couldn't have possibly known was coming, isn't that at least in some part an issue with the game design? I'm not saying signpost everything up front, make us work for it, but a hint would be nice at least. Since we're on the negatives, we also have to talk about trance and how useless it is as a game mechanic. Most Final Fantasy games have some kind of limit break or super attack system that can be used when either charged through taking damage or when hit points get dangerously low. These can be real godsends, turning around battles that are going very badly, and at their apex being some of the flashiest and coolest powers in the game. Final Fantasy IX has a system known as Trance, that sees our characters transform into avatars of their class. It's tied into the game's story as it's a rare and exceptional power that comes about in moments of extreme emotional stress. Trance is pretty OP to be fair, as it lasts multiple turns, and the attacks members can do at that time are really devastating. Well, it would be OP if we actually had any way to control when it happens. Rarely would a trance actually happen at a time when it was really useful, like a boss fight. Most trances happen during regular fights with mobs that only had enough HP to tank one more regular hit anyway. It's far too random to be of any value. Hell, I only discovered this time that Dagger's Eidolon trance ability means the summon creature attacks on multiple turns. In all my previous playthroughs, the RNG on this thing meant it never happened during a significant fight, so I never had the chance to discover it. So yeah, combat has its problems. Thankfully though, it's not deal breaking. Well, I had a couple of rage quit sessions, but nothing I couldn't come back to the next day. By the end of the game, with all your skills mastered and enough gems to spec out a good all-round party, you'll find yourself prepared for all but the most dangerous threats. This guy. This guy is the most dangerous threat. Never fuck with this guy. And you'll find yourself forgetting some of those more frustrating early sessions as you come up against endgame monstrosities which you can coldly and systematically break apart while they are the ones that try to do everything just to stay in the fight. I suppose we have to be weak to appreciate being strong, but that doesn't mean it has to make my neighbours wonder if I'm having a mental breakdown. Easily one of the highlights of any Final Fantasy game is exploring the world map and secret hunting. This is the closest we get to true emergent gameplay, as a lot of this content is optional, and there's always lots of hidden snippets of lore to discover along the way. You won't usually be able to do this until you're past the 2/3 to 3/4 stage of the game, and have access to some kind of airship, and in some cases it won't open up until just before the final dungeon. You are, more or less, led by the nose through the majority of the game, with your only real freedom being to stop and grind enemies for a while to get ahead of the difficulty curve. But you have very little incentive to backtrack at this stage, and you are actively prevented from doing so at times. Early on, you may stumble into a few side quests, but these won't complete for a very long time, and it's quite easy to miss and permanently get locked out of acquiring items needed for these quests. There is, for example, one very specific time when you can return to this village and access these areas here to find a very special coffee. Miss it and you're screwed. Final Fantasy games aren't open world in the sense we think of open world now. How could they be? They simply didn't have the technology. As such, we have a world map that connects the various towns and dungeons together, and this is another of those perfectly fit for purpose elements I've been talking about. No doubt even as far back as the first game, the developers were imagining a rollicking trek across a vast and detailed open world, similar to the ones we can play in today. But when that was just a pipe dream, a vision of a world they might not even be alive to see, compromises had to be made, and this created these incredibly tight world maps that were large enough to hide all kinds of secrets and give the impression of travelling across a large world full of adventure and danger, but never so big that the space served no purpose and people just fast travelled through the whole thing. These worlds are symbolic and scaled down, simplified and yet, like everything else, clear and easy to navigate, meaning you almost never have a problem figuring out where you're going, and even heading to somewhere on the opposite side of the world doesn't become too much of a slog. While there are numerous little things to uncover all over the world, Final Fantasy IX's two major side activities are the Tetramaster card game and Chocobo Hot and Cold. The former I can take or leave, the latter I absolutely hate. It's kind of interesting because while my memories of that first playthrough are somewhat hazy, I'm pretty sure I enjoyed both these activities a lot more back then. This is an interesting reflection on how I've changed growing up, and the degree to which I appreciate having my time wasted by things like RNG when I have a job to do, bills to pay, and something resembling a social life to attend to. It could also be that I basically went through the entire hot and cold game in one sitting on a rainy Saturday, which probably wasn't how it was intended to be tackled. Tetramaster is a game you can basically ignore, but for one tournament around the midpoint of the game. In Final Fantasy VIII, rare cards could be transformed into useful rare items that could give you an edge against the game's super bosses, but there's little to gain from Tetramaster beyond more cards to help you complete your set. The point is, while you can take a break from the game to play anytime you want, and the final dungeon even has a few epic level players to square off against, you really don't have to. It's a fun game for sure, but when you've only got so many hours in the day to play, you may want to spend your energy elsewhere. Most of the secrets hidden in the world map are very hard to figure out. One of the earlier side stories concerning Mognet, the Moogle mail delivery service, has you running deliveries between all the little Moogles that act as your save points. It's pretty easy to follow at first, since you're basically on a set linear path to each of these little guys, but gets out of control later when you realise the only information you have about each delivery is the Moogle's name. So unless you are writing down all of their names and locations along the way, you're going to be revisiting everywhere late game to try and find the right Moogle to give the right letter to. It's a lot of extra work that could have been fixed with one line of text telling you the location of the next delivery along with the Moogle's name. I mean, letters have addresses on them as well as names, right? The Friendly Animals side quest is also just as obtuse. Since this game doesn't have any kind of journal or quest log, it's incredibly bizarre when these little things show up, though that is part of the charm, I guess. And later when you realise there's a set to collect, and maybe something important to find at the end, you're clueless as to which ones you've already met and where the ones you haven't might be found. I had to check a guide and scrub through my video footage to figure out which ones I was missing. Oh, and if you haven't saved a diamond for the last little guy, well, you are just shit out of luck and won't be able to finish the quest without restarting the game. And again, all of this is addressable with a few lines of text. It feels like the developers really wanted to push sales of those licensed Prima strategy guides at the time. And then there's this waste of time. Oh god, this thing. So yes, it's a treasure hunting game, where the length of the quet sound that your big yellow bird makes indicates how close you are to finding a treasure. The problem is, most of these things are very basic and can be bought in most of the in-game shops. You're basically playing many times in hope to strike it lucky and find a chocograph. These are little map locations that hint at the location of treasure buried on the world map. So you go and play the same game out there, but without the timer. You can find really good equipment, the best weapons, and eventually unlock the story of our Chocobo trying to reach Chocobo Paradise, where it can spend all day eating and riding water slides. As our bird levels up and changes colour, they're able to travel across different terrains to find more treasure and even other Chocobo gardens. It's a hell of a grind. You are at the mercy of the RNG gods and the really strict hit detection the whole time, with entire minutes being wasted trying to find one treasure that turns out to be nothing more than eye drops or a remedy. The actual treasure hunting on the world map is kind of fun at least, and the items are all worth it, especially if you want to tackle the mega boss, Ozma. For all my complaining though, the good news is these are optional. You don't have to find everything to finish the game and complete the story. Okay, so I think I've got all of my ranting out of my system now. I know that Chocobo Hot and Cold is kind of a love-hate thing, and many of the less intuitive elements of secret hunting in these games are easily fixed by an internet browser window. But if you're sitting there wondering why would anyone put themselves through all of that, well, remember all that good stuff I was talking about the world and the characters earlier? That's it. That's why. Not only are there lots of hidden scenes like this moment where Vivi meets the ghost of his grandfather, but there's plenty of little lore secrets to find that flesh out the world and the story even more. You go through it because you want to spend time here, because you want to find all the things and say, I did it, to maybe just spend a couple of extra hours with these characters. taking just one more adventure across this fantastical world.
Final Fantasy IX marked the end of an era for the series. With improvements in technology, the worlds and characters that could be displayed in games changed a lot, and the series pivoted towards a much more realistic look. While 10 kept the bright saturated colour palettes and turn-based combat, things began to change, and we would find Final Fantasy become not one, but two MMORPGs, and begin to break away from its well-known identity of turn-based combat and more symbolic and fit-for-purpose world maps. True, games like Crystal Chronicles kept a hyper-stylized look, and Square has definitely infused it into other games like Octopath Traveler. But for Final Fantasy, well, for better or worse, this is where things went. It's not bad exactly. I actually like the characters in FF15 especially, and it's been interesting to see the series get so experimental, even if it did mean that it didn't land a few entries and had to completely remake one of their MMOs. Still, these games in particular stick out in my mind, and have in many ways survived the test of time by embracing limitations and leaning into hyper-stylized visuals. The texture bump provided by these remasters go a long way towards cleaning things up and making the game look good on a modern system, and I can assure you, while the game can waste your time in some places, this world is just as magical to visit now as it's ever been. It's been a hell of a long time between playthroughs, and I'd actually forgotten quite a lot of the game, so it was great to get a second chance at a first time. With adult life being what it is, and this YouTube hobby being a primary focus of my gaming now, it's hard to say exactly when I'll be revisiting this again, so I'm really glad that I seized on a rare opportunity to head on back to Gaia and take one more wild adventure around the world with Zidane, Steiner, and Vivi. For all I've changed and for all its faults, this is still very much my favourite Final Fantasy, and still one of the most interesting and magical worlds that I've ever sailed around on an airship. So since I had such a good time revisiting Final Fantasy IX, I thought I'd use my time to tick off another replay that I've been wanting to do since back when I had a PlayStation 2. And I also wanted to keep the RPG train moving, especially because I got the idea for something a little bit out there to cover in the coming months. So let's leave the Fairytale Kingdom behind and maybe slip through time out of a neo-utopia city and head somewhere a little more post-apocalyptic. Not a wasteland or blasted world though, a place that has more or less been reclaimed by nature. A land almost bereft of giant cities, painted in saturated colours, full of breathtaking views and an impressive collection of magic, divine power and machinery. Next time, let's go on a journey and see if we can't uncover the secret behind an ancient and powerful kaiju that destroys any large civilization in this world, and uncover the secrets of a powerful and utterly corrupt theocracy that sells false hope while actively discouraging people from doing the one thing that could save them, in Final Fantasy X. Hi everyone. If you're here listening to this, then thanks for sticking it out all the way to the end. This one took quite a bit longer than usual for me to write. Obviously, RPGs are much bigger than a lot of the games I cover on here, and the script went through multiple rewrites as I tried to figure out how to manage spoilers and talk about the deeper themes of the game without having to give a full play-by-play of the plot. This may not be the most tightly edited and elegant script I could have put together. I still probably waffled on too much, even though I hacked out several longer rambling tangents in the editing process. But I think I've mostly got it now. Now that I've done it once though, I should get better at tackling bigger games, and since my writing improves with each iteration, well, I guess that's as good an excuse as any to replay this game and remake this video one day. Also, you may have noticed my voice went very nasally during the gameplay section. Something really irritated my allergies that day, but I was determined to get the recording done regardless. Anyway, I hope you had as good a time watching this as I had making it. Be sure to share this around and maybe share your own memories and stories of playing this game with me in the comments. Remember, I also do other social media stuff, and you can tip me a coffee for my troubles here. But until next time, my friends, peace out.